Hey everybody, welcome back to Fisdap. This video covers how to actually document the patient encounters that you are required to fulfill as part of your ride time requirement to become an EMT in the state of Kentucky. As a quick reminder, you need a minimum of 24 hours of field time and a minimum of 10 patient contacts. So in other words, if you ride for 24 hours and you only get 7 patient contacts, you have to sign up for additional shifts to get the other 3 to reach that total of 10. Patient contact is defined as really any sort of interaction while you're on your ride time in which you assess or participate in the assessment or treat or participate in the treatment of any sort of patient, alive or deceased. So anything from taking vital signs to doing any of the skills that you've already learned, to participating in the observation of care. Anything that really allows you to be a part of the care team on that ambulance counts as a patient contact. And you have to document those things. I can't just take your word for it. There's that saying from the beginning of our class about the legal aspects of EMS that if you didn't write it down, it didn't happen. Well, that's not literally true, but it's a rule of thumb. That's a reminder for how seriously we should take documentation of our activities when we're on duty. So as you can see, we're here in Fisdap. We've logged in already, and I've logged in under my student profile, so this should look very similar to yours. And if I go to the old familiar shifts tab, if I go back to my schedule, we can see a shift that I signed up for today, right here in this blue bar. And your menu should allow you, just the same as mine, to hover over this and click on it and get some specific information about the shift and where it is and where to report, so on and so forth. But the easier way to actually document your patient contacts is actually to go back up here to the Shifts tab and come back over to Skills and Patient Care. Now, when I click on this, I see a list of all of my shifts. My laboratory shifts, just like this lab shift button here has a yellow cross on it, my laboratory shifts are all in yellow. And as you can see up here, my field shifts with the blue cross are all in blue. So this is the shift that I was just looking for on my actual calendar. So here it is. It's been scheduled for me. It begins at 1700 this evening. It's 8 hours. And so I go ahead and I go over to the station. I report for my shift. The tones drop and I go on my first call. Well, I need to take some notes when I am on that call. I need to have something to write down a little bit of information because I'm going to actually have to write a miniature chart when that call is over, just like the crew that I'm riding with. So I'm on this shift right now and we get our first call. It's time to fill out a patient care report. So here we are, and we have several sections here: patients, attachments, and shift evaluations. For each contact, every single patient contact that I have, I'm going to click Add New Patient. And this opens up a basically 2-part patient contact form that I need to fill out in a fairly detailed manner. Not only does this constitute a record for us as a program of everything that you've done and the experiences that you've had, but it's practice for how to write an actual patient care chart. So if you were to find yourself as the team leader, you would click this box, but that is very unlikely. This box is generally reserved for our paramedic students who actually do have to act as the team leader officially as part of their training requirements. So you could put in the team size. It's generally going to be 3 people, you and the 2 crew members you're riding with. You also want to put in the name of your preceptor. Your preceptor is the individual working for the agency where you're riding that is responsible for mentoring you during your shift. And we have pretty much all the employees of Madison County and Estill County EMS on this preceptor list. But in the event that your preceptor's name is not on the list, you'd simply click Add a New Preceptor and write them in. So let's pretend that my preceptor is Harrison Black. Actually, one of our program graduates currently working at Madison County EMS, so there's some chance that it might be your preceptor. So Harrison's my preceptor, and we're going to go ahead and check the response mode to the scene. Very frequently, that is going to be licensed sirens. And then we want to be able to detail to what extent you performed the patient assessment. So let's say that you went ahead, you took the history, you performed the physical exam, and let's say that the patient actually required some airway management. If you were to check this box, it now opens up new options, whether or not you successfully or unsuccessfully manage the patient's airway. And you want to be honest about these things. For example, unsuccessfully managing the patient's airway doesn't mean that you did anything wrong. It might just mean that the patient had a particularly challenging airway, and the thing that you attempted to do did not work, and it wouldn't have worked for anybody. But we want to be honest about documenting those sorts of deviations from our goals. We're going to document the patient's level of responsiveness. We're going to give a primary impression. This is your best guess about the thing that seems to be the most wrong with the patient. Patients might have many complaints. They might have many chief complaints in addition to actual things that are wrong with them that perhaps they're not even verbalizing as chief complaints. But we're trying to pick the one that seems to be the most pronounced reason that they have required 911 services today. So let's just go with acute coronary syndrome. We're going to give the patient a criticality, and this kind of refers to the general impression line of your medical or your trauma assessment forms, where you have to give kind of a quick snapshot about how bad this patient really is upon your initial assessment. Well, let's make this guy a yellow. We need to come up here and we need to put in some demographic information. How about a 55-year-old male who is Caucasian? And now we get into the complaints. Remember that these are the symptoms as stated by the patient. So the patient may be complaining of something like malaise, a general feeling of being unwell and being sort of sick. It might also be complaining of weakness. Now, these are not the things that are actually wrong with him. That would be the conditions that you had to select from your primary impressions. These are the actual working diagnosis over here that you're going to arrive at, but these are the patient's chief complaints as they have stated them. So maybe this patient also is complaining of chest pain. There's also an opportunity here to do a secondary impression. There might, in fact, as we mentioned, be some additional things wrong with the patient beyond the primary impression, so we can select that secondary one. For example, maybe some other sort of history of cardiac issues like a cardiac arrhythmia in addition to being suffering from an acute coronary syndrome, or perhaps I also have a respiratory complaint. These should all speak for themselves down here in the vitals and interventions. We're going to take a set of vitals and we're going to enter them in. If you were the one who physically obtained the vital signs, and you would check this box. And this patient has a blood pressure of so, and respirations of so. His pulse was 80. We have the quality and rhythm descriptors that we can choose from. His initial room air pulse oximetry was 96%. And there are additional ones that we can enter in. Let's enter these in if we get them. Really, don't be lazy in your documentation. Be thorough. That's important for all kinds of reasons. But it also is going to allow you, specifically here for our program, to build a portfolio of all the competencies and experiences that you've had. So his initial pain is 8 out of 10. His end title was 35, so on and so forth. As you click through these things, I think you'll start to see that they're pretty self-explanatory. Some of these things you haven't learned about yet, and that's okay. For example, we have learned about our blood glucose levels, but you might not have learned about APGAR or GCS yet because we haven't covered those chapters in our curriculum. Please feel free to ask your preceptors what these words mean, but please also explain to them that you simply haven't covered them in your curriculum yet. So we'll save this information. If we do any airway procedures, again, if you were the one who did it, you would check this box. If it's simply something you witnessed, you wouldn't. So let's say that you actually have the opportunity to put in a King LT airway. It's now going to ask you for more information. Okay, so on and so forth. You really wouldn't be documenting anything for venous access. That's not in your scope of practice. Some of these things have options in them that aren't in your scope of practice, and thus you would not be doing them. The patient disposition. Not every patient gets transported to the hospital. Some patients are deceased when you find them. Sometimes you get dispatched for calls and there actually is no patient on the scene. For example, somebody calls in a report of a vehicle that's crashed into a tree and the driver has already left. He wasn't injured and he called a tow truck or a friend to give him a ride and left the car there. So somebody else calls 911. That's a lot of times referred to as a third-party call. And when you arrive, there's no patient. Again, the rest of these, I think, are kind of self-explanatory, like a lot of other information. And then your transport mode from the scene. If you do have a patient that you load up to transport, describe how it was done. Maybe it was a very critical patient, so you went ahead and transported him using lights and sirens. At any time, you can scroll back up to the top of the sheet and click Save. This is an auto-save kind of a feature built into it right next to it, but if you want to manually save it, you just click that green Save button. So after we complete this first page, we're going to click Next and go to our narrative. This can get a little bit tedious and sometimes even a little bit confusing, but I think you'll get the hang of it. So remember again that the chief complaint is whatever the patient stated is what is bothering them. That might not be the same thing as your actual diagnosis. So for example, a patient may be having an anxiety attack or a so-called panic attack, and they're complaining of respiratory difficulty in the sense that they say, I can't breathe. That is their chief complaint. But then you do your assessment and you determine that in fact they can breathe, but they're suffering from extreme anxiety, and it simply makes them feel as though they can't. So in most cases, your chief complaint is going to be placed in quotes like I just did. It's whatever the patient states to you is the reason that they called 911 or are receiving care. So I can't breathe might also be a viable or plausible chief complaint for a cardiac patient like the one we've sort of been charting. So I'll just go ahead and leave it there. So your history box is mostly your sample information and also any additional questions that you ask during your sample history. So a history of the patient's current medical condition, past pertinent medical history, and that sort of information. In your assessment box, this is where you're going to type the physical findings from your physical exam. You don't have to retype all of the information that you put into your vital signs earlier, but it's good to try to give a description of the way that you found the patient. Where things get a little bit confusing is the difference between the prescription treatment and treatment of patient while at the scene. Usually in our usage of Fisdap, we like to see medications given and treatments that are of a pharmacological nature listed here in the prescription treatment box. And down here in this box about other treatments of the patient while at the scene, these might be some physical things that you do on the scene. So for example, in your treatment box, you might be charting that aspirin, nitroglycerin, and oxygen were administered. And for the sake of brevity, I'm just typing in these sorts of terms to represent what you would chart, but you want to give it some substance. You want to talk about, oh, and I just caught a quick typo there. You want to talk about the doses that you administered, the route that they were administered. Maybe you gave albuterol by small volume nebulizer, or maybe you gave a patient albuterol by their own prescribed inhaler. You want to give that sort of characterization to the treatment that you're giving. Now, down in this box, we might talk about the other things that we did, like assisted in the acquisition of a 12-lead EKG, or help the patient help the crew place the patient on a spinal motion restriction device, or helped with splinting, that sort of stuff. To be quite honest with you, I'm not totally sure why Fisdap separates these two categories and doesn't have you simply write a long-form narrative, but that's how they've separated it. So that's how we treat them. Now, you don't need to write a novel. You don't need to be overly descriptive in your details, but the purpose of a narrative is much like the narrative of a novel, to help the reader really get a sense of what was going on that scene. So again, we wouldn't want to simply just list out terms like this. We would want to type something along the lines of crew administered 324 milligrams aspirin to the patient per protocol based on his chief complaint of substernal chest pain suspected to be of cardiac origin. Because hopefully in our assessment and in our history, we have given similar details about why we think that it's of cardiac origin. So that's how we construct a narrative. We fill in the details. We try to make the reader kind of understand what we saw on the scene. The first few times you write one of these, it can feel extremely tedious, but you'll get the hang of it the more practice you get. Now, if you had a additional patient, for example, it was a multi-patient motor vehicle collision and you treated multiple patients, then you would click add another patient. You would do the same thing for your second patient. When we're all done, we can click save. All right, so we've just logged it in and we've kind of auto-saved it. All right, so when we're all done with this, we would just add multiple patients. Multiple charts for each patient at as the tones come in as the shift goes by. So when we're all done with our shift, we're going to go back to my shift. And at the end of the day, or at the end of the shift rather, we really need to get a preceptor evaluation. So there are many options here. This list actually will continue to scroll. It's just being blocked by the screen recorder software here. And what we really want is a preceptor evaluation of the student. So then we'll click go. And we want to ask our preceptor. Again, we'll select preceptor. We'll select the name, the agency and the name. Why this doesn't auto-populate, I'm not totally sure. But here's our preceptor, Harrison. Here's me as the student. And this looks a lot like your skill sheet. We want to ask our preceptor if they will give us some ratings in these categories. This is not mandatory. I don't have any control over your preceptors. So if they have a lot of paperwork to do, or they have to go take another call, or they desperately need some sleep, it's okay if they don't fill this out. But just politely ask them if they would fill out this internship evaluation of you. And so at the end of the shift, we can get some feedback. If you wish to, you can also fill out an evaluation of your preceptor. So if you click this button, you can click go. And we can put ourselves in as the student. The subject now becomes our preceptor. You would put your password in to confirm that. And you can give your preceptor an evaluation so that you can give them a commendation. If your preceptor was really phenomenal and really helped you and you felt a lot more comfortable with your skills and EMS knowledge afterwards, go ahead and give them a great preceptor evaluation so that we can thank them and we can let them know how helpful they've been to you. So then at the end of the shift, we're just going to lock the shift, just like a lab shift. And you can see here that it is required that this evaluation be put in before we lock the shift. So thanks very much for tuning in. That's a quick overview of how to document your shift activities. I think you guys will have a great time, and I look forward to hearing about your ride time stories.